What are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? As everybody knows, this is the season of Advent. We are now on the third Sunday, so we're already well over halfway through, especially this year when Advent bleeds so quickly into Christmas, with the fourth Sunday of Advent falling on Christmas Eve. So we have less of an Advent season this year. But I think we all know that this is the season of waiting, of preparing, of expecting, of longing and leaning. And what are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? Once upon a time, Advent was seen as a penitential season. And in fact, in Western Europe for a long time, it began on November 11th so that it would match in duration Lent, the great penitential season. But Advent is no longer seen as that kind of a season of penitence. Instead, now it is a season of waiting and longing and preparation. In fact, as many of you know, we swapped out decades ago at Holy Comforter wearing purple, the color of penitence, for blue, the color of the dawn, the color of waiting, the color of Mary, the color of expectation. So this season is one in which we wait and prepare. And what are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? If you think about it, what we anticipate the future bringing shapes our present as much as, or maybe every bit as much as, what has come before. We all know that who we are now and how we've gotten here has been shaped by our past lives, by the families in which we were raised, or the communities in which we grew up, by our experiences, by our education. The past very definitely shapes the present. But when you think about it, isn't it true that the future also shapes the present? That the way we live now, in anticipation of what might come, gives a certain color and shape and tone to our current reality. Think about earlier in life. I think about my life when I was younger. I sort of had this vision of, being in high school and being able to take the classes I wanted and being in shows and doing music. And then at that point I thought, well, now I'm looking forward to college and becoming my own person and maybe moving out of the house and getting a little independence. And then after that began to envision, a career in music, sort of hopefully blossoming and seeing my name in the program in certain concert halls or with certain symphonies. Of course, my life got moved in a different direction, and nevertheless, the anticipation of what might come gave shape to my present reality. The future shapes the present. What we anticipate, what we await, that for which we prepare, does give a foundation to who we are and how we live now. And this season, this poignant and pregnant season, is one in which we are waiting, we are anticipating, we are longing and leaning. And what are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? Advent is such a rich and lovely time in so many ways. It's like that moment when we're at the symphony or the opera, and the conductor comes out and poises her baton, and the violinists have their bows above their strings, and the music has not yet begun. And we're caught in that moment between what was and what will be. That is Advent. Or walking up to the door of friends for a dinner party, and right before we ring the bell or knock on the door, and the darkened windows on either side of the door don't tell us anything, and we catch the fragrance of something that brings back an echo, or we hear a sound in the distance that takes us to a different place, and we're suspended in that time between the times, that is Advent. Or walking to the Ogilvy Transportation Center on a Thursday night with the only smell being that of the exhaust of autos and the primary sound being that of the bell ringers for the Salvation Army, huddled against the cold and maybe against each other. But if we stop and listen, we can hear the world hold its breath. That is Advent. This time between the times, this moment suspended between what was and what will be, this longing and leaning, hoping and preparing. The Baptists knew a great deal about this. John the Baptist had spent his entire life in some way preparing for the moment when he enters the stage in our gospel today. Now, in the other Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John is portrayed as knowing who Jesus is. But in John's Gospel, Jesus clearly is an unknown entity to John. John the Baptizer has no idea for what he awaits, whom he is preparing others to meet. He doesn't know if the Christ is going to come from the heavens above or come on chariots of fire. He doesn't know if he's going to appear anonymously or just simply as one of the people in the crowd. John doesn't know for whom he is preparing others and for whom he is waiting. And yet he has spent his life trying to till the soil to let people be ready for the one who is coming. John knew what it was to wait. And even though he might not have known the specifics of the person who was coming, he knew that he was waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises, the fulfillment of the hope that God had installed and instilled in the human heart. That was what John was waiting for. And what are we waiting for this Advent season? The reality is that most of our lives we spend waiting for something. Waiting for Christmas to arrive, yes, or waiting for the birth of a child or a grandchild, waiting to finish that degree, waiting for a new job, waiting for the adult kids to come home for the holidays. Our lives are spent waiting. But waiting is not a passive activity. Waiting is actually a very active orientation. We can wait, we can prepare, we can long, we can lean by getting ready, even if we're not exactly sure how and when the Christ will come in unexpected and unanticipated ways. We can get ready now by living lives that are open to the surprises of God's endeavors and ways and love. What are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? I love the fact that the Baptist, as he's portrayed really in all the Gospels combined, is so different from Jesus himself. I mean, think about it. The Baptist comes dressed in exotic clothes and eats an ascetical diet, whereas Jesus was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. The Baptist talked about judgment, about separating the wheat from the chaff, but Jesus came and associated with the very chaff that others thought would be separated out. The Baptist talked about that judgment, and Jesus talked about a God of love and embrace, a God who said, "Come to me as a small child." John seemed to get everything wrong, with one exception. One exception. And that was his utter and complete openness to whatever it is God was going to bring and send. And that's much more important than what he wore and what he ate and the words of strong judgment that he articulated. Being open to the unexpected and unanticipated ways in which God moves among us, in the voice of a friend, in the action of a neighbor, in the support of a colleague, and the reverse, the way we reflect God in our voice to another, in our compassion and love, in that simple moment of support and care. So the Baptist was open to the way in which God moved, but also very much wanted not to point to himself, but to the one who was coming. Do you notice in the gospel actually twice he has said, who are you? And he says, I'm not the Christ, I'm not Elijah, I'm not the prophet. Twice he has to convince them that he is not drawing attention to himself. He instead is trying to reflect or point to the one who is coming, whose sandals he's not unworthy. He's not worthy to untie. And isn't that our calling as people of faith, even as we wait and long and lean not to draw attention to ourselves, but in fact instead to be reflections of the one we await? Many of us, we like to see our name on the dean's list or, on the stationery at work. I mean, I'm speaking from experience here. I wouldn't have spent my entire life standing in front of people singing and playing instruments and preachifying and celebrating, at the altar if I didn't actually sort of enjoy it, if I didn't kind of like a little bit of the spotlight. But that's not why I'm here. It's not why any of us is here. It's instead to point, as the Baptist did, to the one who is coming and who is, in fact, already among us. What are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? And that's Advent. Advent is the time when we prepare and lean and long. And just as a child cannot be born without that period of gestation in the darkness of its mother's womb, just as the spring bulbs cannot flower without spending time in the darkness of the earth through the winter, so we will not flourish completely as God's people without walking through this time of anticipation and expectation, of darkness, waiting for the one who is coming. And I think what we ultimately are waiting for, what we're ultimately preparing for, is a sense that something is coming and maybe already here that will make us more and more completely and fully the people God created us to be. That the one who is coming and is already here will have the ability to take away from us our anxiety and our fear, our brokenness, our isolation. Isn't that what this season ultimately points us toward? The one who can make us more fully and completely human, and therefore more fully and completely mirrors of his very being. What are we waiting for? What are we waiting for in this season, this rich, poignant, pregnant season of Advent? How are we preparing to reflect the one who is coming? How are we shaping our lives in response to his life? How are we getting ready and leaning into the future of the one who came, who is coming, who comes?